Welcome back to the Single Dad's online podcast, Online Dad, and I am the Online Dad. Well, we are about a week away from Thanksgiving, and I wanted to do a podcast because I had been fielding lots of emails, text, even some phone calls regarding the grieving process for single dad's children. I'd even had several single moms reach out to me as well, that they seem that their kids are struggling with the current loss within their family. And some of them are from a divorce and some are from a parent dying. And there was just one I think I dealt with a deployment discussion. And all of them had said everything seemed to be fine and they seemed to be happy and they were playing, and then it was a switch was flipped and they just seeing a personality change. And then when I asked them when the loss occurred, all but one of the losses occurred in 2019, so pre-COVID. And they said it was pretty much 2020 and then got worse in 2021 with what they were noticing with their children, their behavior and questions, and they seem more sad. And yes, they're all grieving. But what was interesting is they said all of the parents I talked to said they noticed it kind of the tail end of 2020 and then more so in 2021. And I'm going to attribute it to a couple of different things. They said one was because of COVID, because when you're dealing with a emotional trauma, COVID-19 was an emotional trauma. Not only has it killed over 700,000 people in America alone. And that's, 700,000 grandmas, grandpas, moms, dads, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, classmates, co-workers, etc. But it also is a loss and emotional trauma because our way of life had changed as well. We were no longer seeing, your kids were seeing their friends at school and the normal routine that kids get to do when they're in school, play sports, learn, be with their kids, be with their teachers, a lot of time away from home, and not to mention the children that lost out on graduations and dances and trips and stuff that they normally do during school because of COVID. So that was just another emotional trauma on top of what they already went through personally with their family. So it's not surprising that many children are feeling that extreme pain because it's overload. It's already overload when it happens directly to your family, when you have that traumatic loss, mom or dad passing away or they get divorced. And then you add what COVID-19 had done to us, and I could almost bet cash money all of us know somebody that had lost their life to COVID. And it's not over. Now, while we're making progress and things are slowly trying to get back to normal, there's still people dying from COVID. And there are still people out there that have chosen not to be vaccinated, putting themselves and others at risk of getting COVID or dying from COVID. So we are not out of the woods yet. So it's just a lot on everybody's plate emotionally. So this podcast, what I wanted to do is give you all an overview of grief. And we all know as adults kind of what grief is and how it works, but we don't really understand the process to get you and your children through that grief process. And I'm going to be the first one to say, grief is a lifelong transition. And I'm not saying that you're going to be miserable, your kids are going to be unhappy their whole lives, but you're always working through it at some level. But it's how you get yourself the coping skills and give your children the coping skills to help you work through it, because ignoring it or simply medicating it is not the answer, because that's going to cause bigger problems. So this podcast, what I want to do is kind of give all of you an overview of what grief really is in the grief process. So not only are you going to be able to help yourself, because understand, parents, you are grieving too. You are grieving too, not only from COVID-19, but also from your loss. And while society, especially in America, says, don't show your vulnerabilities, you got to move on, you can't let this eat you alive and cost yourself your job. You have to keep moving. And at some level, that's all true, but that doesn't mean you have to ignore what you're thinking and feeling regarding the loss. You have to work through it too, because it also will eat you alive if you don't let it go through that process. I know a lot of people personally and people over the years that I've worked through, they get stuck in a stage. They start that grief process and something derailed it, and it just kind of got left on the plate. And it never got worked through. And then, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 years later, all of a sudden, some things start popping back up again and reliving stuff that happened so long ago, and takes the adults back, or feeling there's something more sinister involved. So what I want to do is take this podcast and just give kind of the generic overview of the grief process and some tools to work through, especially with the holidays coming. That tends to also dig up some of these feelings. So let's start with just simply understanding the grief process. Right? There's no medical diagnosis to confirm grief. You can't go to the doctor and take a blood test or get a test online, send it in, and get a diagnosis of grief. It doesn't work that way. There is no ending date for grief. While there are religious cultures out there that say you've got 30 days to mourn, you've got 3 months to mourn, you can't put an end date on that. And although long-term grieving may indicate a lack of support or maybe some underlying issues, but you can't just say I'm done, and then wherever you're at, you're done, because it will come back to haunt you. It's like building a bridge over rising flooding waters. Eventually, those flooding waters are going to hit that bridge, or when you come down off the end of the bridge, the waters are all going to be there. And I'll give you a quick personal example. My mother passed away in 2013 suddenly from pancreatic cancer. She got diagnosed. 3 weeks later, she passed away. And it's been 9 years. It'll be 9 years in 2022. And there are still elements about her being gone that still bother me. Now, that's for me, and it's 9 years. I'm not saying your grief and your grief process is going to take 9 years, because it's all individualized and it's all different. But for me, it's been 9 years, and there's still elements of that make me relive some of that pain like it happened yesterday. So I know that I'm not done grieving. There are medications that can be prescribed that will treat the symptoms of grief, depression, anxiety. They're all out there, and they do get prescribed, but it's not solving the problem. You either make the choice that it's a long-term medication issue and you're always going to be on these meds, or you can take the meds to get you on an emotional balance while you work through your grieving process. And then, depending, hopefully that once your grieving process is stabilized and you're getting to that point, reduce the medications or they end. I'm not a doctor. Everybody's different, but a lot of times when things like this happen and the first thing, you do is get medication prescribed and you think that's going to fix it, it's not. There isn't a pill to treat grief. There is no prior experience that prepares you for loss. Now, as adults, we know people that have passed away. We know people that have gotten, couples have split, gotten divorced, have been deployed, deported, incarcerated. We all have those experiences. And then when we're an adult and then, we lose an elderly grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or maybe even a brother or sister and your parents, it still doesn't prepare you for it. You can sit here and logically put it in your head, but when it actually happens, it's like somebody kicked you in the head. Even with terminal illness and you watch that loved one pass away slowly to the point where they do eventually die, you know it's coming, you know it's a process, you know at some point their life will be gone. But when it actually happens, it's like, I didn't see it coming. And that's just how emotions work. A tragic loss and emotional trauma, when that grief process hits, the emotions that you feel, it's like reverting back to a 5-year-old. Your heart is broken and it's just gone. And that's the vulnerability that a lot of people do not want to feel. And so you can sit here and say, yeah, I know a lot of people that passed away. I know a lot of people that got divorced. I'll get through this. Yeah, you might get through it, but it's still not going to stop the feelings that you have. Now, there are 3 words that are kind of synonymous with the grief process: bereavement, grief, and mourning. Unfortunately, a lot of people use these 3 words interchangeably, like they all mean the same thing, and technically they don't. Bereavement is the state of being deprived. That is the loss, the actual traumatic event that you experienced. Grief is or are the emotions from being deprived. Okay, those emotions that you're feeling when you're being tried. It's not always crying. Anger, betrayal, the list goes on. And then mourning, 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 is how you express that grief. whether that be tears or frustration or anger, or you bottle up your emotions and get frustrated, anxiety. Those are the expressions of your grief. And it's some of those expressions of grief that are unhealthy, that will not help you get through the process. Grief affects you on a physical level, an emotional level, and a spiritual level. And when you are not in a healthy emotional state, you are going to make bad choices. And some of them can be long-term and lifelong impacting, and some of them are just, oops, that was stupid. I'm never going to do that again. But you can go back and look at some of these things that people have gone through, or maybe yourself has gone through, and you can link it back to some emotional trauma that you experienced. If you ever watch the TV show Hoarding or Interventions, and they do the backstory on the individual that's being showcased on that episode, there always seems, and I would say probably 99% of the time, there always seems to be some traumatic event that had taken place that started this process. For the hoarding, most of it is, a mom or a dad had passed away, or a brother or sister passed away, or a child had passed away, and that started the hoarding. But it's all over the place. It's not only the death, but it's just some emotional trauma. And that is a lifelong impact, and it changes you mentally and emotionally to the point where it's very hard, the longer it goes, to get the help that you need to work through it. So if you're not in a healthy emotional state, it's hard to make good decisions physically and spiritually. And physically doesn't necessarily mean you're physically harming your body. You will call in sick more. You will go out and spend money, max out your credit cards. You might get in and out of bad relationships, self-mutilation. There's a lot that happens when in your head, emotionally, you're not healthy. There are a lot of books out there on the grieving process. I mean, probably more than I could count. But the one I'm going to base this podcast on is on a book written back in 1969, or actually I should say published back in 1969, by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And the book is entitled On Death and Dying. And what she did is she studied terminally ill patients and their families. And what she did is she watched the journey from diagnosis to death of terminally ill patients and found that they went through some distinct stages before they eventually passed away. And then when she studied the families of the recently deceased of those terminally ill patients, she found that journey of the family members, the survivors, they went through the same identical stages. And her findings is what created the grieving process. Now, again, depending on the experts that you listen to or read or have studied, there are several stages of grief. You have as few as 3 and as many as 15. And I'll be honest with you, I mean, with teenagers and children, you could probably plug in a few extra stages of grief. But what I'm going to do is latch on to Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages. They are really the foundation of how the grief process works. And those 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And some of them are very self-explanatory. Denial, it's not happening. You go on with your day like it's all going to work out, like it never happened. Anger, that's kind of the why me. I went to church, I go to work every day, I pay my bills, I donate my time, I donate my money. Why is this happening to me? And then the bargaining end. Bargaining is you kind of make deals. What if I clean my room more, my parents won't get divorced? What if I go to church every day and donate 10% of my salary that, the cancer goes away? You make those deals. A lot of times it's with God. If you have a higher power, sometimes you make those deals with God. For kids, a lot of times the bargaining comes down to, if I do my homework, quit fighting with my brothers and sisters, promise to do my chores without asking. It's a lot of bargaining. And then that bargaining, after the loss actually takes place, then the bargaining comes to, what if I had said something or done something earlier? Like for my mom, for a classic example for my mom, when I would see her, this is before she was diagnosed and before she was really starting to feel ill, I would look at her and I'd say, she doesn't look right. And I'm like, well, she's probably just getting up there in years and you're noticing the aging and that's what you're seeing. So now that she's been gone, or when she first died, it's like, had I said something to her, 2-3 years before she actually passed away, hey, Mom, you don't look well. Have you been to the doctor lately? Do you look like you feel okay? Had I said something to her sooner, maybe they would have caught the disease earlier and it could have been treated. That's bargaining. And I know that's unrealistic. It's unrealistic, but that's bargaining. And then you hit depression. Depression is that reality check and that vulnerability that finally hits you. Kind of emotionally say, what's the use? And you just let it go. A lot of times people will mourn in private be depressed in private because it shows their vulnerability, crying, frustration, emptiness. But it does tend to overflow into your day-to-day routine. But it's that first reality that the loss had occurred. And for some, that might be right away. And for others, it might take a little bit of time. Then you have the term acceptance. And a lot of people and experts do not like the term acceptance because it kind of gives the impression it's okay. It's okay my relative had died. It's okay my parents got divorced. It's okay that COVID killed a bunch of people I knew. That's not what acceptance is. What acceptance is that you are acclimating or assimilating that loss into your day-to-day routine, kind of a life goes on. It's not that it was great that loss occurred, but you're integrating it into your daily routine, that you're not reliving it like it happened yesterday. And the best way I can put acceptance in an example, you're looking outside your window, the window's closed, you see the storm clouds rolling in, you see the lightning, you hear the thunder, you might even hear the trees hitting the windows. And then when it starts to pour down rain and it's pelting on the glass, you're not getting wet. So while you are remembering that loss and what had happened and everything that transpired up to that loss, you are not reliving it like it happened yesterday. But if I give you that same example, and you get soaking wet because the window is left open, that means there's still some grieving to do and to work on because you're still getting wet. You're still reliving it like it happened yesterday. Now, that doesn't mean there will not be triggers out there that might cause an emotional response. So when I go to the cemetery, to see my mom's grave, and I have other relatives buried there, but when I go see her grave, and especially at Christmas time, because my mother loved Christmas time, it would bring an emotional response out of me of missing her. So it's not to say you will never ever cry again because you think about your loved one or you go visit your loved one at the cemetery or think about some of the great memories. That won't cause you to have an emotional response. That's why grieving is a lifelong process. But if you're reliving it every day like it happened yesterday, then that means that you haven't worked through the grieving process. Now, here's the other kick in the head with grief. There's no order of the stages. All the stages do have to be processed completely to get to that point of life goes on, but you may bounce back and forth through those stages of grief. So you can't write the stages down and then check them off when you're not feeling it anymore. So when you're not feeling denial, you say, okay, I'm done with the denial. You might go from, instead of denial, you might go from anger and then down to depression and then acceptance and then back up to, and hit denial then. There's no order, especially with your children, especially when they're younger. There's no order. It will bounce all over the place. But rest assured, you do have to work through these stages to get to that level of acceptance. Now, again, with children, I said there's probably 4 or 5 things you could add to the grieving process with them, and that's mainly because your children lack the experiences you have as adults to help with coping mechanisms to work through their loss. And that's why it's important that the adults in their lives that are important to them help in this journey. So a lot of times there's a lot of unrealistic guilt, unrealistic fear, pining, isolation, confusion over the loss. Younger children, they're very concrete in their perception. The light switch is on, the light switch is off. So when you're talking with them about that loss, it's very simplistic and age appropriate. And then as they get older and those gray areas of life pop in and the questions start, it's like adding a dimmer switch to that light switch. All of a sudden it's not just on and off. There's various levels of intensity of light. And that again brings questions of that grief and what they go through. And that's why it's important for those adults to work on that grief process together. Grief is personal. It's individual. It defies your logic because you can sit here in your head and make logic explanation. But you got to remember, each person's grief, including your children, is universal. Right? It's universal. We can go by a cemetery and see all these headstones and know that all these people have gone through the grief process, but nobody feels the pain like I feel the pain. Nobody feels the pain like my children, feel the pain or my children's feeling the pain. It remains as unique as your fingerprints. The circumstances of the death or the loss can be identical to your neighbors, can be identical to a friend's, can be identical to something you saw on TV. But when all is said and done, nobody's feeling the pain that I'm feeling, and that goes for your children. You feel isolated. You feel like you're the only one going through it. And I'll be honest with you, you might know people that have lost somebody, a coworker, and they seem to always be put together like nothing is wrong. I will tell you, while on the outside and in society they may show that everything is fine, but in reality, especially at the beginning of that loss, they were going through it as well. Your children's grief is different than adults, and I said that earlier. It tends to plunge deeper, spreads wider, and is revisited at most developmental benchmarks, such as a physical and emotional development, award ceremonies, graduations, weddings. Any stepping stone can cause your children to revisit the grief. And when I say physically and emotionally, that means as they get older. So while you may have explained that, if you got divorced from your spouse, and they ask you, why did you get divorced? It's something as simple as, well, it takes a special kind of love to be married, and we're fighting, and we want everybody to be happy, and we want your kids to be happy, so the best choice was to get divorced. Now, fast forward, they get to be 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. They may have other additional questions, because now they're thinking in it more, with their eyes wider, a greater understanding of how the world works at their age, and they may have additional questions. And you yourself as an adult, you hit a benchmark as well. You get that big promotion that, you want to share it with the family members that you love that are no longer with you. Your children are the same way. You get married, you get married a second time. So while your folks, your grandparents were with you the first time you got married, you want them with you again. So you yourself might go through that, but especially with your children, any major stepping stone, whether that's biologically, chronologically, school related, sports related, marriage, graduation, whatever, can trigger that emotional response. So it's real important for parents to make sure they are on with their children when they need to have those discussions. Now, when you start discussing the grief process with your children, you have to understand that the emotions of grief have to be acknowledged. You can't deny or ignore them. You can't say, hey, get over it, you got to move on with your life, forget about it, or don't do it, it's just going to upset your grandma, your grandpa, or your mom or your dad. You can't do that, especially to children. They have to be acknowledged. As unrealistic as it may seem, they have to be acknowledged, because if they're not acknowledged, they remain buried inside, where they will haunt your child for years. And that child then becomes an adolescent, then becomes a teenager, becomes a young adult, an adult. And those buried grief feelings now not only haunt the child for years, are now going to haunt the adult for years. At some point while growing up or well into adulthood, those unspoken words of loss will pop up, mark my words. They can be expressed through, it could be alcohol abuse, drug abuse, depression, illness, fear of relationships, or unbridled anger. And then that gets expressed also in an unhealthy situation. There's a reason why gangs are constantly recruiting younger and younger children, because they're going through an emotional trauma right now, and they're not feeling supported, they're not feeling loved, and they want to be accepted, even though it's unhealthy. The grief process can't be rushed. You can't just sit your kids down and talk about it and say it's done. The personal journey for each person has its own timeline. So if you have multiple children, while one of your children might seem to be working through it a little bit easier and faster than your other children, doesn't mean that, okay, they're done, so you should be done. It doesn't work that way. So while you might be able to focus a little more attention on the other children that are having issues with it or struggling with it, just understand everybody's in a different place, and depending on their age also will help put them in a different place. But it takes as long as it takes. So as a parent, you have to be patient and you have to encourage it. So the best way to move through this grief process is to share your story. Grieve as a family. What exactly happened and how you felt. You've got to be able to work through that, and you start your story with your kids. Now, of course, it's age appropriate. They don't need to know the gory details behind why the loss occurred. Okay? If they ask questions that might suggest they want more details, you make it age appropriate, or you do it in such a way, because I'm sorry, younger children don't need to know all the details. My parents divorced when I was 10. I'm 56 years old now. There are elements of my parents' divorce that I don't know about, and I will never know about. They're both gone now, but I don't need to know. I don't need to know the stories. I can make assumptions. I can guess that maybe some of these things happened, but I never know. And I know that when I did ask my mom about certain things, she would deflect it and reword it in such a way that I accepted the answer. While as I got older, as a teenager, I might say, oh, there's more to that. But that was what I got. So it's real important that your children are able to communicate with somebody they can trust, and that should start with the parents. But you can't just sit them at the dining room table and expect them to talk about it. You've got to start with yourself. Now, they're not going to get an epiphany that as soon as you start sharing your story, that all of a sudden they're going to open up. They may stare at the walls. They may shrug their shoulders. They may get up and walk away. They may not have answers because they're not sure how it's going to be received, especially if you've had family members say, don't talk about this with your dad or your mom. You're just going to get them upset. You're just going to get them angry. You're just going to make them cry. And it sits in the back of your head because the last thing you want to do as a child is hurt your parents. The other problem with the parents' perspective of this is we as parents do not want to admit that some of our choices do hurt our children. And if we divorce, the spouse, that's hurting your children. Even under the best of circumstances, the way of life, the sense of security, what they grew up with, what they knew to be normal is changed, has changed, is changing. And it will impact your kids negatively. And even though, both of you have split amicably and the visitation and everything seemed to be working, and you go to each other's games and you go to those graduations together, it's still going to impact your children. But with you sharing your story shows them that you're willing to be vulnerable with them. And you're able to talk about your feelings. Now, it's okay to cry in front of your children. It's okay. It's normal. That's telling your children it's okay to do this. Then what happens is you'll start seeing your children slowly to open up and talk about things on their mind about the loss. The only thing I will tell you as a parent, they may come to you at the most inopportune time and want to discuss some things because it's on their mind and they want to do it now. As a parent, and sometimes it can get frustrating, especially if you're at work or if you're working remotely and your child comes up to you, that you just want to dismiss it because you've got to focus on what you're doing. I will say to you, and again, one of the reasons I'm doing what I'm doing is because I made a ton of mistakes with my own children. And, I've learned from those mistakes and learned to move forward. And some of those lessons I learned helped me through the next level of the grieving process. But what you don't want to do in today's age is if they want to talk to you about something is whether you're in your phone or in your computer is raise that finger without looking at them and say, we'll talk about it later. Or I'm busy, we'll talk about it later. You have just dismissed and blew an opportune moment to talk about what's on their mind. And it may not be about the loss, but you're laying the foundation that you're going to be available for your children when they need you. What you can do is stop what you're doing. If you're on a Zoom call, blank the screen and mute the voice and look at them and say, hey, Daddy's got to finish this call. Give me 15 minutes or give me 1 hour and you've got my attention. And then go on and finish what you're doing. But do not tell them 15 minutes if it's going to be an hour, if it's going to be 2 hours. Don't tell them an hour if it's going to be really 3 hours. Be realistic in that timeline because they do acknowledge that you are working or you are doing something. Now, if you're playing a game, that game needs to stop and you need to make your undivided attention with your children, period. But if you're doing work-related stuff, you can tell them, give Daddy 15 minutes, give 20 minutes. But you stop at that timeline. Start the timer on your phone, put it on your microwave, egg timer, whatever, and that's when you stop. But as soon as you tell me we'll deal with this tomorrow, or tell them we'll deal with this tomorrow, you've now lost them. You've now dismissed their thinking, their feelings, and what's going on through their head. Now, you may stop what you're doing in 15 minutes. Go sit down and talk to them. And it might be something completely, oh my God, really? You stopped me working for this? But again, you can't dismiss what they're thinking and feeling. It might be school related, it might be a project related, but what you've done by stopping and making the time, even though it may frustrate you that you stopped working or ended a call early because they wanted to talk to you, you've now validated that their feelings mean something to them and to you, and you're willing to make the time to listen. Kids may go wake you up in the middle of the night because they woke up or something's bothering them and they can't sleep, and they want the reassurance from the parent that everything's going to be okay. As exhausted as you are as a parent, you need to sit up out of bed, you need to turn on that light, and you need to give them your undivided attention. Now, if you're remarried or you're in a relationship and there's somebody in bed with you sleeping, then you need to get out of bed to a private space where you can talk with that child. Now, there are limits to that, especially what's in the middle of the night. You want to get them through whatever is bothering them to the point where they can go back to bed. And as a parent, your intuitive instincts are pretty good that you'll figure that out. But you got to get over that initial hump, and then once you get that discussion there, and you feel that you're at a place where your child can go to bed, it's like, tell you what, it's late, we both have to get up early, you for school, me for work. Why don't we pick this back up tomorrow when I get home for work? And you put it in your calendar because it's real easy to forget. And that usually will do it. And you can have the discussions. I know that I've gotten up a couple times in the middle of the night wanting to talk to my mother, about whatever it was that I wanted to talk to her about. And she did. And I know at the time she was working 3 jobs and her day started at 5 a.m. and ended at 10 or 11 o'clock at night and sometimes later. But she always made the time. You need to do the same with your children. Participating in any type of support group or others experiencing the same struggles and feelings can be beneficial. It's not that going to therapists or counselors is a bad thing, but a lot of times with your children, trying to trust an adult is a little bit harder than trusting your peers. When you're with your peers, and think about it when you guys were all younger, you talk to your best friends about stuff or your friends about things before you'll talk to an adult. And sometimes as a parent, you just say, well, I'll just take them to a counselor and it'll make it work. Not necessarily. Or it may take longer to get to the point that you need. It's not that a professional can't help your children. They can. But usually if you do some sort of peer support group, experiencing similar situations and feelings can be more beneficial sooner rather than later. Because they trust their peer group more than they trust adults. Remember, we as adults somehow in their mind caused the loss. Now, if you got divorced, that's where their head's at. If they lost that parent to death, they might blame you saying, well, hey, if you took the mom to the doctor sooner, this wouldn't have happened. So they're all over the place. So a lot of times, that peer support works a lot better. A lot of times peer support tends to be free or very, very cheap. When you go to a counselor or a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist, it's not that it's bad. I mean, I encourage it if you can, but many people can't afford it and many people's insurances don't cover it. So to write that check for, $50, $100, $200 an hour, and especially if you have multiple kids and it's not a group session, it can get very expensive, and a lot of times parents can't afford that. So they lean towards those peer support groups. Sometimes peer support groups can be that catalyst that might need additional counseling. So there's the pluses and minuses of both of that, but participating in support groups and others experiencing the same struggles tend to be beneficial. Now, one dad kind of chastised me because I recommended a support group for him, and his wife had passed away, and put him in a support group where all the children in that group particularly were parents had divorced. And he called me very angry because their child said to them, well, I don't have anything in common with them because their parents divorced, their moms and dads are still alive, my mom is not. And they got really upset by that. And I just simply said to him, I understand the concern, but I'm going to encourage your child to continue the support group as long as the facilitator there understands where your child's loss is. If they don't know what the loss is, it could be a little difficult. But chances are if they're in that support group, they know what the loss is. But when you have a divorce, it's the death of a relationship. It's the death of a way of life. It's the death of something that your child was comfortable with and you were comfortable with. So even if it's divorce, the pain is the same because everything that was normal to that child and to you is now changed. It's the death of that particular chapter in your life. So you are experiencing a form of death. For a divorced family, it's the death of that relationship, that mom-dad relationship, that spouse at the home all the time, all the traditions, everything that go with that. That life has ended, it has died. So please, please, please just make sure that don't dismiss it if there's nobody there that has experienced the death of a parent. Now, when you're ferreting out these support groups, I mean, you need to say, hey, my wife passed away. My kids are really struggling with it. What can you recommend? And if you can't find something, that backup is you can put them with a group with kids that have lost a parent through divorce or deployment, because that is the death of a relationship. The feelings are very similar. The experience may not be, but the feelings are. All right, I'm going to stop there because we've covered a lot. So what I'm going to do is continue on with discussions as the holidays come in, revisit the grief process, and try and talk about some things in the future, especially as the holiday season approaches us. If you have any comments or success stories on how to work through the grieving process, by all means, go to my website, www.singledadsonline.org. Single dads is plural. And go on my website, click my links for different articles. There's email there. And let me hear your story. Let me hear some success stories, what had worked for you. Or if you have any questions, by all means. But understand that your children love you unconditionally, and the reason why you raise them to the age of 18, because they need your support and your guidance. And those of you that are out there listening that have older children in their 20s and their 30s and they're out on their own, they still need your guidance. The relationships change. You're not necessarily raising your children, but they still need that support there from you. So have a great rest of the day. We'll be talking to you soon, and thanks for listening.